Hello, Dr. Ravikant.
Yeah.
Yes, you're live, sir. You can start your presentation now. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Myself, I am Dr. Ravikant Moka. I did my MBBS from Konasema Institute of Medical Sciences, Amalapuram, Andhra Pradesh. I did my MD General Medicine from KVG Medical College, Sullia, Karnataka. Currently, I am a practicing physician at Vaishnavi Hospital, Rajahmundry, Andhra Pradesh. First of all, I would like to thank Team Liberate for giving me this opportunity. So today I will be discussing about thrombosis and coagulopathy in COVID-19. So as we all know about the current ongoing pandemic, the second wave of COVID-19, and how badly it has impacted the world and especially India. So you can see here the COVID-19 global status as on 6 p.m. of 18th May 2021. India leads the second place in the number of total cases, around 2 crores 52 lakhs cases, and every day more than 2.5 lakhs, 3 lakhs cases are being reported, and we have 2,78,000 deaths till now. So this is the status of India as on 6 p.m. 18 May 2021. So coming to our topic, coronavirus disease is an infectious disease caused by severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2, also called as SARS-CoV-2, which has posed a significant threat to global health. Angiotensin converting enzyme 2 has been identified as the functional receptor for coronavirus. So infection by SARS-CoV-2 is mediated by binding of its spike protein to the angiotensin converting enzyme 2 receptor, which is highly expressed in type 2 pneumocytes in the respiratory system. So approximately 30 to 40% of infected individuals remain asymptomatic. Of those patients who develop symptoms, 81% are mild with no symptoms or mild pneumonia, and 14% are moderate, having difficulty in breathing and decreased oxygen saturation levels. So however, 5% of these symptomatic patients develop intense endothelial activation with exuberant inflammatory response similar to a cytokine release syndrome, which has been associated with acute respiratory distress syndrome and multiple organ damage. So the overall case fatality rate is estimated to be 2.3%. So in this slide, you can see the course of the disease. So around 30% of patients do not have any symptoms, whereas 55% develop some mild to moderate symptoms, 10% develop severe symptoms, and 5% develop critical symptoms. So in this group of patients who develop severe symptoms or critical symptoms, so the mortality is up to 15% in patients with severe symptoms and up to 50% in patients with critical symptoms. So this ACE2 receptor, it is also widely expressed in the cardiovascular system. Therefore, there are multiple cardiovascular implications of COVID-19. Patients with pre-existing cardiovascular disease are at increased risk for serious adverse events. Moreover, severe infections have been associated with myocardial injury with a subsequent impact on mortality. So finally, individuals with COVID-19 may have thrombotic and coagulation abnormalities promoting a hypercoagulable state and resulting in an increased rate of thrombotic and thromboembolic events. So the incidence of thrombosis in COVID-19 in patients who require hospitalization, the rate of any thrombotic event is 16%, which varies between 11.5% in non-intensive care unit patients to 29.4% in ICU settings. So now coming to the pathophysiology of thrombosis in COVID-19. So what is the mechanism? How this virus gets into the body? Where does it go? How does it infect the various systems in the body? And how does it leads to thrombosis and coagulopathy? So if you see here, the virus has, this SARS-CoV-2 virus has effects on endothelium. It affects platelets. It affects the coagulation and fibrinolytic system, and it affects the myocardium. So here, if you see how the virus affects the endothelium, it can lead to endothelitis. It can cause an imbalance of the ACE2 regulation. It can lead to rapid cell death. It can lead to hyperinflammation. So in this slide, you can see the pathophysiology, how COVID-19 infects the body and leads to thrombotic events. So here if you see, this SARS-CoV-2 binds to the transmembrane ACE2 proteins to enter type 2 pneumocytes, macrophages, and other cell types. So because of the tropism of SARS-CoV-2 to this type 2 pneumocytes, the virus can interface with a large area of the pulmonary vasculature, because the pulmonary vasculature contains many ACE2 receptors which can bind to the pneumocytes. Furthermore, it can infect the pericytes and perivascular cells which are present in the alveolar surface of the microvessels, where they are embedded in the basement membrane. So this phenomenon mainly occurs in the pulmonary alveolar tissue. So, but this can also occur in other areas like the glomerular capillary loops, small bowel capillaries, myocardiocytes. So in the endothelium, the gap junctions provide the portal of direct communication between endothelial cells and pericytes, and they maintain the vascular integrity. These pericytes are known for their important role in vascular homeostasis and regulation of inflammatory processes. So if there is any degeneration within the pericytes get infected, and if there is any degeneration, this can cause tissue injury and lead to organ damage. So in humans, abundant expression of ACE2 receptors on endothelial cells enhances these endothelial cells to be vulnerable to the SARS-CoV-2 virus. Due to the immune response within the endothelium, so obviously the endothelium gets inflamed. So several autopsy reports of some patients have showed accumulation of inflammatory cells, the viral inclusions with diffuse lymphocytic endothelitis and apoptotic bodies by histological analysis. So coming to the imbalance of ACE2 regulation. So what is ACE2 and what is ACE1? So this ACE2, this catalyzes the conversion of angiotensin 2 to angiotensin 1 to 7. This angiotensin 2 is a potent vasoconstrictor. It is pro-fibrotic, it is pro-inflammatory, it is potent vasoconstrictor, and angiotensin 1 to 7 is a vasodilator. It has anti-apoptotic properties and it is also anti-proliferative. So when there is imbalance in the ratio of ACE1 to ACE2, when this ratio increases, it will cause harm to the body. So in cardiac patients, there is increase in the ACE1 to ACE2 ratio. This imbalance is caused by down regulation of the ACE2 receptors. Also in smokers and in patients with pulmonary arterial hypertension, in patients with Alzheimer's disease, there will be down regulation of the ACE2 receptors. So it is suggested that in SARS-CoV-2 infection, there is down regulation of this ACE2 receptors. There is down regulation of this ACE2 receptors. As a result, the ACE1 to ACE2 ratio increases. So this leads to here you can see. So this leads to increased pro-fibrotic effect, increased pro-inflammatory effect, and it increases the pro-apoptotic effect, and it also causes potent vasoconstriction. So now coming to host cell death. So how does it happen? So SARS-CoV-2 membrane protein induces apoptosis. So this apoptosis in COVID is described uniquely as pyroptosis. What is this pyroptosis? Pyroptosis is a highly inflammatory form of regulated cell death, which occurs via activation of so-called inflammasomes. Inflammasomes activation induces formation of pores on the cell membranes. On the cell membranes, these inflammasomes lead to formation of pores. So through these pores, there will be secretion of the cytokines, that is interleukin 1b and interleukin 18. There will be secretion of these interleukins, and there will be influx of water into the cell. Subsequently, the cell becomes swollen, and that will lead to cell death. So this is how the death of the cell happens in COVID-19. Coming to hyperinflammation. Hyperinflammation in severe COVID-19 cases is a result of extensive cytokine response in the pulmonary vasculature, resulting in intravascular coagulopathy, which leads to more severe systemic inflammatory response. So now coming to this hyperinflammation. So as we all know, many doctors describing the hyperinflammation as cytokine storm. So you might have heard many times this word cytokine storm, cytokine storm. So what is the cytokine storm? Cytokine storm is also called as macrophage activation syndrome. Macrophage activation syndrome. This has another name also. This secondary hemophagocytic lymphohistiocytosis. So some authors, they have described this type of thing in COVID-19, but it's not exactly cytokine storm. So we'll talk about this. So some authors have compared the cytokine response in COVID-19 to macrophage activation syndrome. However, some clinical characteristics differentiate macrophage activation syndrome from COVID. What are these? In macrophage activation syndrome, the ferritin levels will be extremely high. But in COVID, we see the ferritin levels will be only moderately elevated. Another thing is, in cytokine storm, there will be impaired liver function. But in COVID, impaired liver function is not typically seen. Some clinical and lab features resemble macrophage activation syndrome in COVID-19, but these features are distinct from the conventional DIC. So if you see the difference between the disseminated intravascular coagulation and COVID associated coagulopathy, the involvement of lungs is marked in COVID coagulopathy, whereas it is only moderate in DIC. Bleeding is uncommon in COVID, but it is prominent in DIC. Everybody knows that. Thrombosis is more common in COVID. Thrombocytopenia, whereas thrombocytopenia is mild in COVID, whereas it is marked in DIC. Anemia and hemolysis are unusual in COVID, but they are common in DIC. Fibrinogen levels may be increased in COVID, but they may be decreased in DIC. D-dimer levels, they will be markedly elevated to 2 to 3-fold times. They will be elevated in COVID coagulopathy, whereas in DIC they will be only mild to moderately elevated. Now coming to the effects on platelets. So what is the effect of SARS-CoV-2 on platelets? The pathophysiology of thrombocytopenia in COVID-19 are entirely not understood, but may be related to reduction of primary platelet production, increase in platelet destruction, or decrease in the circulating platelets. Platelet production may also be impaired because of bone marrow suppression induced by this so-called cytokine storm, or direct infection of the hematopoietic system and the bone marrow stromal cells. Platelet destruction may be related to increase in autoantibodies also. So here we have to talk about something called neutrophil extracellular traps. So what are these neutrophil extracellular traps? So this picture you can see. So it's also called as nets. Here, this actually there will be leukocyte activation, specifically the neutrophils, through various vascular and platelet pathways, which may promote neutrophil extracellular traps. So these traps are nothing but web-like structures. These are web-like structures. They have essential role in thrombin production and end organ injury. So some autopsy series, they have found that this neutrophil infiltration in the pulmonary capillaries, acute capillaritis with fibrin deposition, extravasation of neutrophils into alveolar space, and neutrophilic mucocytosis. So these nets are ideal foundation for binding of activated platelets, erythrocytes, leukocytes, and activating factor 9 and generating thrombin from fibrin production. Now, what is the effect of SARS-CoV-2 on coagulation and fibrinolytic system? So, most of you might be knowing the most consistent abnormality we see is raised D-dimer. D-dimer will be markedly elevated. So, in patients with severe illness, there will be elevation of D-dimer. Some group of experts proposed a classification. Actually, there is no classification. There is no proper classification to stage the disease depending upon the coagulation abnormality. So some others, they designed one classification system. You can see here, this is the classification system. They have characterized it, they were divided into stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3. Stage 1 includes patients at home or hospitalized in non-ICU with mild symptoms. There will be pulmonary microthrombi which are localized. You can see pulmonary microthrombi at the peripheries of the lung, which are localized at periphery, the peripheral microvasculature. They may not be detected on the CT scan, routine CT scan. Stage 2, if you see, this stage, the patients will be having severe symptoms and they might need ICU support. They may have the ventilation perfusion mismatch caused by the thrombi or emboli, which will be detected on the CT scan. They may have DVT also. Stage 3 is seen critically ill patients who need mechanical ventilation or extracorporeal membrane oxygenation. These patients exhibit pulmonary embolism or extrapulmonary thrombosis involving several organs such as intestines, limbs, coronary, and cerebral circulation. So here you can see in stage 1, D-dimer may be 2 to 3 times elevated. In stage 2, 3 to 6 times it will be elevated. And in stage 3, more than 6 times it will be elevated. Platelet counts may be normal in stage 1. They may be slightly decreased in stage 2. And in stage 3, they might be markedly decreased. PT will be normal in stage 1, but it will be markedly prolonged in stage 3. Fibrinogen will be increased in stage 1, but in stage 3, fibrinogen may be decreased. Inflammation will be localized in stage 1, but it will be systemic in stage 2 and stage 3. DIC will not be present in stage 1, but in stage 3, that is the advanced stage, DIC may be present and the outcome will be worse. So now coming to the effects of this virus on myocardium. So myocardium, acute myocardial injury is defined by elevation of cardiac biomarkers, mainly the high sensitivity cardiac troponin. Everybody knows that. So how does this virus impact the myocardium? It can lead to direct viral myocardial injury. It can cause microvascular injury. It can lead to systemic hyperinflammatory response with resultant myocardial injury. It can lead to acute coronary syndrome. It can just lead without any obstruction in the coronaries. It can just lead to oxygen supply and demand mismatch. It can cause cardiac arrhythmias and it can cause pericardial effusion also. So how does the virus lead to direct myocardial injury? So in the beginning, we were talking about the ACE2 receptors. The presence of these receptors on myocardial and vascular endothelial cells supports the potential for direct viral infection with resultant myocarditis. Microvascular injury, thrombosis can occur in myocardial microcirculation. Therefore, if in patients with STEMI and COVID-19, if the coronary angiogram is normal, microvascular thrombi could represent myocardial injury. Cytokine storm can lead to, as we all know, cytokine storm, the release of interleukin 1b, interleukin 18 can affect either the pre-existing atherosclerosis in cardiac patients, or it can promote accelerated atherogenesis also. So injury secondary to oxygen supply and demand mismatch. So as we all know, patients with COVID-19, they'll be having fever, they'll be having tachycardia, and there will be sympathetic stimulation, there will be physiological adaptation. This can lead to increased myocardial oxygen requirement. Also COVID-19 pneumonia with hypoxemia, there will be increased requirement of oxygen, demand for oxygen will be more, and patients might be having sepsis, septic shock, coagulopathy. This can impair coronary perfusion. Cardiac arrhythmias, risk factors for arrhythmias include hypoxia, sepsis. They can be having electrolyte abnormalities, and the medications which the therapeutic medications for COVID-19, the antiviral drugs like lopinavir, ritonavir, or ivermectin, azithromycin, hydroxychloroquines. These can also cause arrhythmias in these patients. And the cytotoxic effects and systemic inflammation that will lead to pericardial inflammation and pericarditis. So that is about the pathophysiology of the COVID-19 thrombosis in detail. So what are the hematological abnormalities we see in COVID-19 disease? Most consistent abnormalities, as we all know, there will be leukopenia, lymphopenia in 30 to 50% of patients, mild thrombocytopenia, increased D dimer levels, PT will be prolonged, APTT may be prolonged, TT may be prolonged. And along with this, there will be associated risk of ICU admission, mechanical ventilation, and mortality. As I said, DIC will be seen, may be present in advanced stages. And if in case it is present, the prognosis will be worse. So now how to divide these patients into high risk, low risk, moderate risk, and high risk? How to stratify the patients? There are some methods like Caprini score, improve score, and Velta score. This is improve predict score. So this predicts the risk of venous thromboembolism in medical patients on admission. So here they have given 4 criteria: previous history of VTE, that is present 3 points; history of malignancy, if patient is treated or untreated within the previous 6 months, 1 point; thrombophilia, 3 points; age more than 60 years, 1 point. So to predict the risk of VTE, if the score is between 0 to 1, the risk of VTE is low. If it is 2 to 3, the risk is moderate. If it is more than or equal to 4, the risk of VTE is high. Caprini score, this score is usually used for risk assessment in surgical patients. So lab testing for risk stratification. So before talking about this risk stratification, as we all know, there is plethora of data. So much of data is there online, and so many recommendations, so many guidelines, and which one to follow? There is a dilemma which one to follow regarding the recommendations. So uh, before going into the recommendations, before that we'll see how to risk stratify the patients. So International Society of Thrombosis and Hemostasis interim guidance recommends obtaining D-dimer, prothrombin time, platelet counts, and fibrinogen levels for all patients who present with COVID-19, as measurements may be helpful for risk stratification of patients who may need close monitoring and admission to the hospital. That means, so during in the first visit of the patient itself, if we can obtain these parameters, so we can divide the patient. We can see, like, if the patient, whether is the patient really needs admission, does the patient really need close monitoring, does the patient need ICU admission. So depending on the parameters, we can decide what to do. Another thing, patients with markedly raised D-dimer, that is 3 to 4 fold times elevated D-dimer, prolonged PT, platelet count less than 1 lakh, and fibrinogen less than 2 grams per liter, these patients needs hospital admission. Parameters should be monitored after admission, and more aggressive critical care is warranted, and experimental therapies should be considered if the parameters worsen. So these recommendations are given by the International Society of Thrombosis and Hemostasis interim guidance. So now guideline recommendations, which one to follow? These guideline recommendations, various international guidances differ on dosage and duration of thromboprophylaxis. So therapeutic anticoagulation regimens and preferred medications. ACCP, that is American College of Chest Physicians, recommends low molecular weight heparin or fondaparinux over unfractionated heparin. Unfractionated heparin is preferred in patients with bleeding risk and in patients with renal failure or patients needing imminent procedures. Also, it recommends increasing dose of low molecular weight heparin by 25 to 30% in patients with recurrent venous thromboembolism despite therapeutic low molecular weight heparin anticoagulation. ACF recommends low molecular weight heparin over unfractionated heparin whenever possible, so that to avoid laboratory monitoring and exposure. In patients with acute kidney injury or creatinine clearance of less than 15 to 30 ml per minute, unfractionated heparin is recommended over low molecular weight heparin, as it has short half-life. So if there is any active bleeding, how to correct the bleeding? American Society of Hematologists, it recommends to transfuse 1 adult unit of platelets if platelets are less than 50,000, 4 units of plasma if INR is more than 1.8, fibrinogen concentrate of 4 grams, or cryoprecipitate of 10 units if fibrinogen is less than 1.5 grams per liter. In patients with severe coagulopathy and bleeding, consider 4-factor prothrombin complex concentrate, that is 4-FPCC, instead of plasma. ACC recommends platelet transfusion to maintain platelets more than 50,000 DIC and active bleeding, or platelets less than 20,000 in patients at high risk of bleeding or requiring invasive procedures. Fresh frozen plasma 15 to 25 ml per kg should be transfused in patients with active bleeding with either prolonged PT or PTT ratios. Fibrinogen concentrate or cryoprecipitate should be used in patients with existing severe hypofibrinogenemia. Prothrombin complex concentrate can be used if fresh frozen plasma is not available. Tranexamic acid should not be routinely used in COVID-19. Now, VTE prophylaxis regimens and preferred medications. So ISTSIG and ACCP recommends low molecular weight heparin at standard dose. American College of Cardiology recommends low molecular weight heparin 40 milligrams daily, or similar low molecular weight heparin regimen, that is deltaparin 5,000 units daily, can be administered. with consideration of subcutaneous heparin of 5,000 units twice or 3 times daily in patients with renal dysfunction, that is creatinine clearance of less than 30 ml per minute. Once daily regimens of low molecular weight heparin may be advantageous over unfractionated heparin to reduce missed doses associated with worse outcomes and reduce healthcare worker exposure. Also, it will reduce the use of PPE kits and all. So ACF recommends increased intensity of prophylaxis in critically ill patients, that is low molecular weight heparin of 40 milligrams subcutaneous twice daily, or low molecular weight heparin 0.5 milligrams per kg subcutaneous twice daily, heparin 7,500 units subcutaneous 3 times daily. So as we all know, the guidelines given by the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. So in moderate disease and severe disease, they have recommended anticoagulation. The dosages differ in both the groups. So in moderate disease, conventional dose prophylactic unfractionated heparin or low molecular weight heparin based on weight. Example, enoxaparin 0.5 milligrams per kg per day subcutaneous. There should be no contraindication of high risk of bleeding. Similarly, in severe disease, enoxaparin 0.5 milligrams per kg per dose subcutaneous twice daily. So when to hold anticoagulation? So American Society of Hematology recommends that thromboprophylaxis is recommended even with abnormal coagulation tests in the presence of active bleeding, and it should be held only if platelet count is less than 25,000 or fibrinogen is less than 0.5 grams per liter. So abnormal PT or PTT is not a contraindication to thromboprophylaxis. Therapeutic anticoagulation may need to be held if platelet count is less than 30,000 to 50,000 or fibrinogen is less than 1 gram per liter. So when to use mechanical thromboprophylaxis? ACF recommends intermittent pneumatic compression in patients with contraindications to pharmacological thromboprophylaxis. So it is reasonable to consider both mechanical and pharmacological thromboprophylaxis in critically ill patients if there are no contraindications for each modality. Considerations of thrombolytic treatment. So what are the indications of thrombolysis? STEMI, ST elevation MI, acute ischemic stroke, massive pulmonary embolism with hemodynamic instability. So in pregnant patients in particular, thrombolytic therapy should only be used for acute PE with life-threatening hemodynamic instability due to the risk of maternal hemorrhage. ACCP suggests that in patients in whom therapeutic anticoagulation fails and who continue to have evidence of cardiopulmonary compromise, thrombolytic therapy may be beneficial. Similarly, ACC mentions that systemic fibrinolysis is indicated in patients with significant hemodynamic unstable, high-risk PE, and catheter-based therapies be reserved for situations that are not amenable for systemic fibrinolysis. Duration of anticoagulation. ACF recommends at least 3-month course of anticoagulation for patients who are started on anticoagulation for a presumed provoked thrombus from the inflammatory state of COVID-associated coagulopathy, but did not have imaging available for confirmation. They also recommend the standard anticoagulation guidelines to be used to determine length of anticoagulation beyond the initial 3-month period. So similarly, ACCP and ISTH recommend a minimum of 3 months of anticoagulation in those patients with a confirmed pulmonary embolism or proximal DVT. Thromboprophylaxis at discharge. So FDA has approved post-discharge prophylactic anticoagulation regimens. Rivaroxaban and Betrixaban may be considered in patients with high risk for VT, a low risk of bleeding. So out of these two, Rivaroxaban is best. The dosage of Rivaroxaban is 10 milligrams once daily. It should be continued for 30 days to 45 days, around 6 weeks for thromboprophylaxis in outpatient setting. Duration of anticoagulation recommended by ACF is based on the timing used in clinical trials, which is 31 to 39 days for Rivaroxaban, 35 to 42 days for Betrixaban. Extended prophylaxis with low molecular weight heparin or directly acting anticoagulants for up to 45 days in patients at high risk for VTE, that is D-dimer more than 2 times elevated. There is reduced mobility of the patient and patient has an active cancer. There is low risk of bleeding. Then extended prophylaxis should be recommended. So ASH mentions that aspirin can also be considered based on studies for VTE prophylaxis in low risk patients after orthopedic surgery. So aspirin is not mentioned in any of the other guidelines and recommendations with the exception of ISTH. So if we summarize all the guidelines for VTE, so use of low molecular weight heparin is preferred in inpatient setting, whereas directly acting anticoagulants may be preferred in outpatient setting. However, in patients who need invasive procedures, unfractionated heparin may be optimal option because of the shorter half-life. Finally, complete duration of treatment of VTE event should be more than or equal to 3 months. 3 months, it is mandatory. Beyond 3 months, depending upon the requirement and risk of the patient, you need to decide whether to continue the anticoagulation or not. In patients with severe pulmonary embolism, the routine use of inferior vena cava filters is not recommended, although their placement may be considered in selected cases such as recurrent pulmonary embolism despite optimal anticoagulation or clinically significant VTE in the setting of absolute contraindications to anticoagulation. So guideline recommendations should be followed for reperfusion strategies in patients with acute pulmonary embolism. Hemodynamically stable patients should be preferred to give anticoagulation. However, patients with hemodynamic instability should be managed with systemic fibrinolysis or with catheter-directed options as an alternative if not suited for systemic fibrinolysis. Most patients with DVT can be managed with anticoagulation. However, only patients with phlegmasia or with truly refractory symptoms may benefit from endovascular techniques. So now coming to pregnant women. So what are the recommendations for pregnant women and what are the recommendations for lactating women with COVID-19? So if antithrombotic therapy is prescribed for pregnant women prior to diagnosis of COVID-19, therapy should be continued, it should not be stopped. For pregnant patients who are hospitalized for severe COVID, prophylactic dose anticoagulation is recommended if there are no any contraindications. As for non-pregnant patients, VTE prophylaxis after hospital discharge is not recommended for pregnant patients. Decisions to continue VTE prophylaxis in the pregnant or postpartum patients should be individualized considering the concomitant VTE risk factors. Management of anticoagulation therapy during labor and delivery requires specialized care and planning and should be managed similarly in pregnant patients with COVID-19 as other conditions that require anticoagulation in pregnancy. Unfractionated heparin, low molecular weight heparin, and warfarin do not accumulate in breast milk and do not induce any anticoagulant effect in the newborn. Therefore, they can be used safely in breastfeeding women with or without COVID-19 who require prophylaxis or treatment. So in contrast, directly acting oral anticoagulants are not routinely recommended because there is lack of safety data of the drugs. There is no data on the use of scoring systems to predict VTE risk in pregnant individuals. Additionally, during pregnancy, D-dimer has no much importance. D-dimer will be physiologically increased in pregnant women throughout the gestation period. So, to increase the D-dimer level, it should not be an indication to predict VTE in pregnant women. So now, patients on antithrombotic therapy per standard care. So some patients will be coming and asking, doctor, I have some cardiac problem. I'm already taking, I'm already on antiplatelet. I'm on dual antiplatelet. I'm on anticoagulants, or I have some problem and I have to undergo fibrinolysis. So can I take the routine drugs which are being prescribed for COVID-19 like doxycycline, azithromycin, ivermectin, or antivirals, some other drugs and all. So can I take the drugs? They'll be coming and asking. So if we see patients at risk or with mild presentation who do not require COVID-19 investigational therapies, there is no change. That means, see, in patients with COVID-19, that diagnosed with COVID-19, they're asymptomatic, they have only mild symptoms and they do not require any treatment for COVID, like that doxycycline or antiviral, if they do not require such treatment, they should continue their treatment. They should continue whatever the medication, whatever the cardiac medicines, or whatever the antiplatelets, anticoagulants they're taking, they should be continued and they should not be stopped. So in patients with moderate to severe presentation who require some medication for COVID-19, and if they are on some antiplatelets, anticoagulants, fibrinolysis, there will be some risk of drug-to-drug interactions. So if you see this antiplatelets, aspirin, if a patient is taking low dose aspirin, low dose aspirin is safe, it can be taken. But when it comes to the P2Y12 inhibitors, that is clopidogrel, prasugrel, these drugs have drug-to-drug interactions with the COVID-19 investigational therapies. For example, antiviral drugs, that is lopinavir and ritonavir, it has drug interaction with clopidogrel. Also, cilostazol also has drug interaction with clopidogrel. So such patients, they are not recommended. COVID-19 investigational therapies are not recommended. Parenteral antiplatelets can be considered in these patients. If they need to continue the antiplatelet therapy, parenteral antiplatelet agents can be considered because they do not have any drug-to-drug interactions. And coming to the anticoagulants, vitamin K agonists and directly acting anticoagulants interfere with antivirals and monoclonal antibodies. The vitamin K antagonists and directly acting anticoagulants, they interfere with antiviral lopinavir, ritonavir, and monoclonal antibodies, that is tocilizumab, they interfere with the drugs. So they are not recommended. So these patients who are on directly acting anticoagulants or vitamin K antagonists, they should be changed to low molecular weight heparin during this therapy. So this therapy, mostly patient will be taking for 5 days or he might be taking for 10 days. So until he finishes this therapy, they should be changed to low molecular weight heparin. So once the therapy is completed, then you can shift the patient back to his regular anticoagulants. This has to be remembered. Regarding fibrinolysis, tissue plasminogen activator has no much drug-to-drug interactions, so it is safe in patients who are taking investigational therapies. So that is regarding per standard of care. So finally, what are the take-home points in today's discussion? Hypercoagulability is a prominent and deadly feature of COVID-19 infection, especially in patients with severely or critically affected cases. There is high incidence of thrombotic events in hospitalized patients, which is estimated at 15 to 30%, which is even higher when patients are in ICU and the mortality is very high. A high level of D-dimer, that is more than 1000 nanograms per ml, is associated with aggravation of pneumonia and progression of ARDS, and is a individual predictor of thrombotic complications. Microthrombi, macrothrombi, both small and large vessels can be affected. There are a lot of guidelines. There is a plethora of data available, but the evidence is limited. Randomized control trials are in progress to determine the optimal dose of anticoagulation for prophylaxis. So careful and dynamic thrombotic risk assessment should be performed in all COVID-19 patients, whether patient is hospitalized or not. This assessment includes classic thrombotic risk factors, but also biological parameters such as D-dimer and C-reactive protein. Patients on anticoagulation at admission, switch them to low molecular weight heparin. And all hospitalized patients should receive the standard thromboprophylaxis. Documented VTE, continue anticoagulation for 3 months. Extended prophylaxis is individual, depends on the individual patient risk. It can be none to maximum up to 45 days. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ravikant. Thank you so much for sharing this with us, sir. It was an insightful session. And I thank you on behalf of all the doctors who joined today and from Library. and we'll look forward to host you again in future, sir. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome, sir. Bye.